We are back, and I'm thrilled to be joined once again by Annelle Sheline. Annelle served in the Office of Near Eastern Affairs in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. She has also been a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, where she focused on the Middle East. And that's where you may recognize Annelle before she joined the State Department. She was on our program a few times to talk about Yemen and all of her good work on that. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Annelle. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
So when you joined the State Department, we had briefly spoken. I was reminded when I messaged you about this, and you had basically said, I'm joining the State Department, and so I won't be able to come on in a while to talk about Yemen. But so I didn't think we'd be speaking so quickly. But but you did resign earlier than I believe your contract, significantly earlier than your contract delineated in protest of the United States' support for Israel. So I guess just take us through your decision there and how you got to this moment to resign from the State Department.
Well, Emma, thanks so much for having me and for all you've been doing to draw attention to what's happening to the people in Gaza. So I thought about resigning every time there wasn't accountability for Israel attacking institutions that are protected under international law, like hospitals or mosques or churches. I did decide to complete the full year, which I was obligated to do to pay back an Arabic language fellowship I had received from the government. And also because my team was working on the human rights reports, and I was responsible for 5 countries, and I didn't want to leave my team, which was already stretched thin. And I want to highlight that the work that our office and other offices within DRL, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, that these people and our office do incredible work on the issue of human rights. It has become a lot harder in the Middle East in the aftermath of October 7th, but it is still extremely valuable. And I found the work that I was doing to be very valuable. It's just that once we were done with the 2023 human rights reports, I just didn't want to be part of the government at all anymore, even to do work that I still consider very important.
Let's actually just take a quick break, Annelle. I'm sorry, your audio's cutting in and a little out. We'll cut this out of the podcast. Just one second. No, don't worry. We'll be right back, folks. We are back. We fixed a little bit of our audio issue. So, Annelle, you mentioned that you had thought many times about resigning your position from the State Department, but that you had this fellowship and you had obligations on that front. Part of what you write about in your opinion piece announcing your resignation in CNN is how many of your colleagues urged you to take your story public. Can you just speak a little bit about the work environment in the State Department right now and how many of your fellow coworkers are feeling similarly about United States support for Israel in this moment?
So, the State Department is huge, and I don't want to claim to speak for everyone, but many, many people are truly horrified by what's happening. In particular, there are groups like Feds United for Peace, which is just sort of an informal group of people. I'm on various Signal threads with people from across the State Department and across other U.S. government agencies as well. Even in touch with some people from European civil society who have been involved in efforts to try to work on the support that their governments provide for the state of Israel. And it's not only that people are shocked by what's happening in Gaza, although they are, but it's also, I think, that many people who work for the US government, especially for the State Department, they work for state because they believe in this idea of what the US should do in the world, should, be a force for international law, for the rule of law, for human rights, for these various things that the Biden administration said they were going to reestablish after the Trump administration arguably did a lot of damage to, U.S. participation in things like international institutions or, support for allies. So I think many people feel extremely betrayed by what this administration is doing, and they worry about the impact this has on the U.S. role in the world moving forward.
And you mentioned in your piece, let's pull actually up this part here that I wanted to read. It's in CNN, the opinion piece explaining your decision. For the past year, I worked for the office devoted to promoting human rights in the Middle East. I believe strongly in the mission and in the important work of that office. However, as a representative of a government that is directly enabling what the International Court of Justice has said could plausibly be a genocide in Gaza, such work has become almost impossible. Unable to serve an administration that enables such atrocities, I have decided to resign from my position at the Department of State. The word genocide. Now, as you mentioned, I am a commentator, right? So I can say that I feel it's a genocide. But of course, the International Court of Justice will determine that. But that word in particular, how often is it being used by your State Department colleagues? At least the plausibility of it being committed by Israel against the Palestinian people in Gaza.
I mean, officially within the State Department, you would not see that word used in official documents. I think unofficially, you do have people talking about it, and especially within some of these spaces that I was talking about, of people who have joined kind of these efforts to try to push back. I mean, again, within, state is a bureaucracy and a hierarchy, and until the very top of that hierarchy, which is President Biden, decides that he wants a new policy, we're not going to see anything else coming out of the State Department. But there are people inside state who are working on these issues, working on accountability for Israel, so that if the president decides that he wants to take a different stance, things are ready to go. Those laws are in place that he is refusing to follow, things like the Leahy laws. But again, the government is set up to implement the will of those in leadership, and so it doesn't really matter necessarily some of the work that's being done on the lower levels. It's not going to come out unless those in leadership want it to.
And can you expand on the Leahy laws and the other provisions that the United States is in violation of with its policy? I mean, the State Department has determined through its review that Israel is not committing human rights violations with United States military aid. Everyone who hears that has to laugh. I mean, it clearly, in my opinion, is there to protect their own position and also to not padlock any future aid. But that position on its face is untenable. I mean, what was your reaction to seeing the State Department reach that conclusion?
So the Leahy laws are legislation that prevents the provision of U.S. military assistance to units of a foreign government that have been determined to have committed gross violations of human rights. Although the State Department has yet to acknowledge them, as you said, it is clear that they have occurred time and time again, and not just in the aftermath of October 7th. In addition, 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act would also prohibit the provision of U.S. military assistance to a government that is blocking American humanitarian aid, as the government of Israel is doing. When the State Department came out and reaffirmed the U.S. government's position that Israel is not in violation, it was not surprising, because this is the position that the administration continues to maintain despite the mountain of evidence contradicting them. But I do think it just reflects a political calculus. How, unfortunately, I think the administration continues to maintain this same calculus, despite the fact that clearly the political winds are shifting, and we see a majority of Americans not supporting what Israel is doing. I think the administration is just refusing to acknowledge that. And this is part of why I decided to go public, because it does seem that public pressure is the only thing that is contributing to any kind of a shift, even though thus far the shifts have been tiny. But I hope that this administration will take a different approach and will acknowledge reality.
How about the uncommitted vote as something that has pressured the administration? I know that's kind of not the State Department's role as I understand that many of your colleagues are committed to the idea of, no pun intended, of being apolitical in that sense, and not putting their finger to the wind in that way. But in terms of what you observed for the Biden administration's reaction to this growing electoral pressure from the Democratic base, what did you see there?
I mean, like I said, I think things like the uncommitted vote and people working on those efforts in the primaries, that's one of the only things that is causing this administration to shift. I don't want, I think people have come out sometimes. I mean, I've gotten some messages about this, that this is just supporting the return of President Trump. And, do I think he would be better for the Palestinian people? I don't think so. But my hope is that this administration will be willing to shift within enough time that it could not only make a huge difference for people in Gaza, but could change the views of people who up to this point are feeling like it's either Trump or Genocide Joe. I know for some people, there are some who say, look, he's lost my vote forever. There's no way I'd vote for him now. I think personally, if this administration were to come out and cut off the provision of offensive weapons to Israel, to insist that adequate and sufficient aid be allowed into Gaza, that the bombings stop, then he would have my vote again. I think that would be a huge shift and would be really a sea change in American politics. So I really commend the people working on that, because I think it's one of the only things that's making a difference.
In analyzing this from like an academic perspective, I know you have a PhD, you were at the Quincy Institute studying the Middle East before you joined the State Department. When you're looking at United States diplomacy and standing in the world, what does this support for Israel do for American credibility in the region and internationally, just more broadly? And if you could compare that to the degradation of international standing that the United States saw happen to it in the wake of the Iraq War, what are your observations there about U.S. standing in the Middle East from a diplomatic perspective?
I think you're very right to highlight the effects of the Iraq War and, the illegal means that the Bush administration used to invade Iraq. I do think that this administration had tried to really reestablish some of like I was saying, America's participation in international institutions. I think many people, especially within the State Department, saw U.S. support for Ukraine as a means to sort of reestablish American credibility, standing up for a democracy, a civilian population undergoing an illegal invasion and assault. I think the Ukraine-Gaza juxtaposition just really highlights the hypocrisy here. And I think that was something that came up frequently with State Department colleagues, that when Ukraine happened, they talked about how they were encouraged to support Ukraine, even if they weren't working on Ukraine, just, wear a Ukraine flag pin, or like put up a poster or something. Whereas with Gaza, the message people were getting was, this isn't your area, you don't work on this, you don't know what you're talking about. And just, I think the American self-image was so ready to grab onto this support for Ukraine as a means of reestablishing America's self-respect in kind of the aftermath of the war on terror. And I think that the ongoing support for Israel has just really reaffirmed the extent to which that self-image is false. And although I personally would really welcome if the US government were to try to adopt policies that did affirm human rights and all of these ideas about American exceptionalism and standing up for the rule of law and the world, the liberal international order. But in general, we don't see that happening. And I do think it has been a huge blow to American credibility. It's made a mockery of the UN Security Council. The US abstained on that vote, but then immediately came out and said it was a non-binding resolution.
Which is a lie, because UN Security Council resolutions by definition are supposed to be binding.
Exactly. This was a question I asked. The State Department has held open fora about Gaza, which I really welcome that they were, inviting people to speak about this. Many people were concerned and devastated, and continue to be. But this was a question I asked of a senior official, which was, it seems that this policy, this U.S. support for Israel, is being treated as more important than the question of China, which this administration likes to talk about, the question of Ukraine, which, again, big priority, Russia, climate change, human rights, participation in international institutions, a foreign policy for the middle class, whatever that's supposed to mean. Just all of these priorities the administration campaigned on and claimed to be governing in the name of, or making decisions to support. Why is the U.S.-Israel relationship seen as more important than all of these other questions, many of which are existential? I would, climate change, a great power war with China. I mean, that would be, it could be nuclear annihilation. I mean, these are huge issues. And yet the ongoing support for this far right-wing government in Israel, for some reason, is seen as more important. And that, the official didn't have a good answer to that question. I still don't have a good answer.
Can you give us a sense of how unique the relationship is within diplomatic channels between the United States and Israel? How other relationships, maybe within the purview of your office or your colleagues, might be treated within the normal kind of day-to-day work of the State Department versus the very top-down, and let's be clear, this is from Biden himself. This is clearly ideological for him, as he's a Zionist and he has said so. How unique that is from the other work of the State Department, and how that kind of feels within the work in the State Department.
Certainly. That's a good question. I think that, so like with my office, which focuses, or my former office focuses on human rights, it's very easy to criticize Iran or Syria rightly. These are governments that engage in horrific human rights violations. But so does Saudi Arabia, and so does Israel. So does the UAE. So, and yet those countries are routinely not called out for their human rights violations. In terms of your question of the uniqueness of Israel, I would, my previous work at Quincy focused primarily, a lot of it focused on the Saudi war on Yemen. And in particular, things like the US saying they were going to cut off offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia, which initially they sort of did. It remains the official policy.
We talked about this, actually, I'm remembering now, because offensive weapons were categorized in this very broad sense, and, or offensive weapons was quite specific, and defensive could mean anything, basically.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I'm remembering now. Yeah.
So just to highlight there that even though the US-Saudi relationship is extremely important in terms of, the way it has been understood for decades, but Biden still was willing to take that step of cutting off offensive weapons as wobbly, although there were there was some wiggle room there. They still publicly took this step, and until the notorious fist bump with MBS, initially Biden was maintaining a degree of distance from the Saudi throne, which was new. That is not what we've seen with Israel. There have been no willingness to cut off weapons. Even when Netanyahu, canceled the visit to just come ask for more weapons, and now he's rescheduling the visit to talk about the impending invasion of Rafah, which is going to be, as I mentioned in the op-ed, it's I can't even talk about it. Biden isn't doing anything different. He's just continuing to support what this government is doing. I think what I'm also really concerned about is the war expanding. And sorry,
it's okay. I've cried a million times on this show about this, so yeah, it's good to have another soft-hearted woman around to cry with me.
Yeah. It's, I really worry about the US getting dragged into another war in the Middle East. I know many, the majority of Americans, when you poll them, are really tired of, sending young people to go die in the Middle East. And I think that this administration is not doing enough or really much of anything significant to insist to Israel that if Bibi invades Lebanon, the US is not going to back him up. I think, in contrast, Bibi knows the US would back him up if he did that, and that's why he's preparing to do so.
And the bombing of the Iranian embassy in Syria overnight. I mean, on yesterday, that is also a major escalation that I'd imagine is extremely concerning to you.
Absolutely. And it's because Netanyahu's political interests are best served by keeping all the violence going as long as possible. I mean, I feel like there's been insufficient attention to the fact that the Israeli hostages are sort of held up as like, well, Hamas just has to give back the hostages, which they do. But Bibi's not interested in that, because then he wouldn't be able to continue to justify all this violence. I mean, if that was actually his primary goal, that could have happened months ago. I mean, that could have happened within the first few weeks. But that's not his goal. And I think, the families of the hostages who are just desperate to get their family members back are not, they're protesting. There have been huge protests in Israel against the fact that the government of Israel is prioritizing bombing and starving the people of Gaza, and now likely expanding this war into a regional, what could become a nuclear conflagration. And and yet criticism of Israel continues to be tarred as anti-Semitic when, this government is not listening to their own people. It's just so, I don't understand why this continues to be the policy that the US government just continues to support. There are all these questions about American credibility and, other governments crossing red lines and, like, this is going to send a signal that China can invade Taiwan. There's all this like analysis about how the U.S. has to stand firm on what it says it's committed to, what the red lines are, and that hasn't. And yet, Bibi keeps crossing all of these red lines, and where are all those people shouting about the U.S. has to like maintain credibility on these issues?
Right.
It's
maddening. It's infuriating. And I mean, if I haven't said it before, I really just respect your courage immensely on this, and to speak for some of your colleagues who may not, it's really hard to leave your job. And we don't have a ton of social safety net in this country to allow for that. So being able to hear your inside perspective on this is invaluable. And you mentioned Saudi Arabia earlier. The U.S. prioritizing Israel is also affecting massive deals with Saudi Arabia in us warming to them once again. The Biden administration is pursuing the Abraham Accord path that the Trump administration furthered, which Hamas has said, and I think military experts agree, contributed to their desperation to attack on October 7th because they felt this is our one chance and we're being cut out and forgotten entirely as the United States recognizes another major Arab power in the region. What has been your response, and perhaps if you feel comfortable speaking for your colleagues, some of them, to the Biden administration pursuing a Trump administration policy that is destabilizing the region?
Nah, I won't try and speak for my colleagues, but just for myself, I mean, I think this comes directly from Brett McGurk. This is the policy that he has long been in favor of. And I think just as you said, I mean, this is already the Abraham Accords were, with the UAE, with Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, the countries that normalized with Israel in 2020. That was done over the objections of their populations. There was this notion that the fate of Palestine was no longer a salient issue for Arab publics. And I think for, a country like the UAE, which has so much money and a very small population, they are able, they were the first, and they were able to quash, they already have systems in place to quash dissent of all kinds. Morocco has seen massive protests since October 7th consistently against the fact that the Moroccan government has normalized with Israel. I think if MBS were to try to normalize with Israel, it would be, I think he would struggle to contain the reaction. He's thus far been quite successful at suppressing dissent and opposition to some of the changes he's made. And some of these are really positive changes, especially for Saudi women, but he has made them unilaterally and without any sort of, public input. And he's, jailed the female women's rights activists that were pushing for such things that are now legal, like the right for women to drive. And many of those people are still either in jail or under travel ban. So if I mean, part of the issue here is just the fact that it's not really necessary. Like, these countries are not at war with Israel, or they're not, they already have a quiet relationship with Israel. Right. They quietly do trade. Like, it's just the fact that they haven't officially normalized, it doesn't mean that they are a threat to Israel. Just public opinion aside, these governments know like you think about like Egypt or something, where there's massive opposition to what's happening. And yet, the military of Egypt is extremely powerful and has managed to suppress dissent and has locked up thousands of people. And
also a top recipient of our aid.
Right.
Not a coincidence.
Exactly. Following the peace treaty, the Camp David Accord. So all that to say that, first of all, the Abraham Accords are essentially unnecessary because these are not governments that are actually like threatening military action against Israel. And they are deeply destabilizing because they are so unpopular in their own countries. And so I don't really understand why it continues to be such a priority, other than, it's a big priority for AIPAC and DMFI, and it's just continues to be seen as the right move politically within the American political establishment. Although I do hope that is starting to change, as we talked about, that like when Rami Youssef was on SNL and said "Free Palestine" and people cheered, that's a big shift.
Yes, we covered that yesterday. Blind Anti-Imperialism writes in, can you ask her what she thinks about Biden's comment on his come to Jesus moment conversation he thinks he was going to have with Bibi? Does Joe actually think he's helping the situation and the pork giving aid is helping? It seems like incompetence on his end.
I mean, I don't know. I've asked myself this of like, is he just deluded? Is it just, it's just a generational issue, like his generation and others, just Israel exists differently in their imagination than it does in reality. Or does he just not care about the people in Gaza? Like, is it racism? Like, I don't know. I don't really know. I think it's, I think part of how he got elected is because people saw him as like generally a pretty good guy, was like his persona. I think that's kind of how I saw him. And now I just kind of question that, because I don't know how how his staff would be insulating him from what's happening to people in Gaza, and yet he continues to make these same decisions.
Annelle, let me know if you need to run. I'm keeping you a little bit over, so apologies on that. But I just wanted to ask you about the Houthis and, given your expertise in Yemen, their blockade of ships, and how there has been an insistence from the administration that their attacks on commercial shipping vessels is sufficient for the United States to respond with bombing. Meaning an action also that they don't necessarily need to go to Congress for as well, because it's a response to an attack. That is clearly, in my view, a distortion of wartime law and rules of engagement in that way. But also, what frustrates me is this lack of taking the Houthis' claims about why they have been attacking these ships on their face. They're saying this is in order to put pressure on the United States to stop supporting Israel, but then we're hearing, oh, they're just terrorists. Can you speak a little bit about their incentives and how and if that the administration in the United States is perception or public posture on this is different from the reality?
I mean, this has been great PR for the Houthis, kind of coming out as one of the only Arab governments actually trying to do something for the people of Palestine. I do take seriously their assertion that, if the blockade of Gaza were lifted and, if there were a ceasefire, that they would stop attacking ships. I believe them on that, because they are interested in establishing themselves as, the internationally recognized government of Yemen. Although at this point, even though they do control the territory where the majority of Yemenis live, they remain sort of the unrecognized de facto power. The U.S. government is not interested in bolstering their legitimacy. I do think that the Saudis are enjoying, kind of experiencing schadenfreude in that they wanted more support from the U.S. against the Houthis, and the U.S. was really pushing the Saudis, which is great, to accept the ceasefire that went into place in 2022, that sort of had remained in place even though it officially expired that in October of 2022. And I do give the Biden administration credit for their efforts. Including Tim Lenderking, who's been trying to reach some kind of a political solution there. And now, the U.S. bombing Houthi positions. It is, I think the Saudis just kind of find it amusing because, just like the Saudis struggled to, take out this sort of what was once a ragtag group of rebels and is now a much more powerful military force. The U.S. is similarly experiencing those difficulties. I do think it's interesting. We've seen kind of less attention on that lately. I think the U.S. government just didn't want to give them more attention and credibility for that. In general, the Houthis are an armed militant group. They block humanitarian aid. They commit horrible violations of human rights. But they're also likely, they're the de facto ruling authority in Yemen. So at a certain point, we'll just have to see when the international community either recognizes that, or if the U.S. government decides that it is going to escalate there and really try and take them out, I think, which would be devastating for the civilian population in Yemen. People who know more about Yemen than I do would argue, or have argued, that just U.S. policy on Yemen has been so schizophrenic, and they're not great options at this point.
Lastly, Annelle, I bringing it back to your piece in CNN here, how you ended it. I just wanted to touch on this in particular, where you wrote here, I am haunted by the final social media post of Aaron Bushnell, a 25-year-old U.S. Air Force serviceman who self-immolated in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington on February 25th. Bradley, can we pull this up on the screen, please? Many of us like to ask ourselves, what would I do if I was alive during slavery, or the Jim Crow South, or apartheid? What would I do if my country was committing genocide? The answer is, you're doing it right now. I can no longer continue what I was doing. I hope that my resignation can contribute to the many efforts to push the administration to withdraw support for Israel's war, for the sake of 2 million Palestinians whose lives are at risk, and for the sake of America's moral standing in the world. Annelle, can you speak to why that particular post by Aaron Bushnell spoke to you in such a way?
Yeah, I remember feeling shocked that Aaron's self-immolation was not addressed by the administration, by the government. It was such a horrifying and also just powerful action. And I think many people read that post, or became aware of that post and questioned. I know I certainly did, and I've spoken with others who have as well. And it's, I think people maybe don't take seriously enough what he did, or I've heard people try and justify it or say, he came from, he had a lot of trauma, or he came from this sort of sort of isolated background. I've heard people say a lot of things instead of just the reality of he made this choice to try to draw attention to what the U.S. government is doing. And I just wish people took it more seriously and really thought about what they're doing, whether it's staying silent or, I mean, it may seem silly, but even just something like putting up a ceasefire sign in your window or in your yard, I think, that helps people know that this is growing and like other people are also devastated by what's happening. And so I think for those who are feeling really disempowered by all this, and if you just don't know what to do, I would say start there, because I do think that these visible expressions of support, on social media, in your window, in your yard, that helps other people know that they're feeling, that you are reflecting their feelings. Or maybe for someone who's not paying attention, they might then prompt them to look at like, wait, what's going on? Because I do think I want Aaron's death to have mattered, and I want my, going through this, some of what I've been dealing with to matter. And I do think that even just little things like that are what's going to make a difference here.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, Anelle, you have a young child, right? And resigning from one's job when you have a young kid is not an easy decision. And I know that some of your colleagues were in similar circumstances. So I just want to thank you for that and for all you're taking on individually to make this stand, because that's not easy. And I'm sure you had these conversations with people at work.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I'm in a position of privilege, being able to I didn't spend my whole career in state. I think, for me to transition back out of state, it's a little bit easier to imagine than for people who have spent their whole careers on the inside.
Right.
And, hopefully I'll find something. I don't expect to work for the government again.
Well, that's my other question is just of that you made that for a lot of people. I'm sorry. Okay. Just really briefly here. I mean, what were you excited to work for the government? Was this something that you had dreamed of? What colleagues that haven't resigned but are disgusted? I mean, they have probably worked their whole professional lives to get to this particular moment, right?
Definitely. I mean, my background. I mean, Quincy is very critical of the U.S. government. And I think personally, having lived in the Middle East, I have many reasons to be critical of the U.S. government. But I was excited at the opportunity to get to be on the inside, to get to kind of see how things are done. I was especially interested in the work I was doing on human rights. I think I would have been somewhat less interested if it wasn't for that office. I found that work to be very meaningful. And I do, I know some people have said that they, while they support what I'm doing, they're just like, wow, it's just too bad because having someone like you on the inside could have been really helpful. And so, I do wonder about that, but, I mean, maybe someday there'll be a coming administration where my resignation wouldn't blacklist me. Maybe in the future there might be a role for me to go back into policy.
Well, I hope so. Bear and Man 12 says, please tell Anelle that her name will go down in history as a savior of the innocent. Museums will speak of her name. So that's one of our IMers. Trying to just show some support from me as well. I really appreciate it, Anelle. I mean, it's amazing to witness your bravery here. I really appreciate your time today as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks to you and your team.
Thank you.